70 million people participated in World War I. World War I was one of the largest wars ever, and it was also one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. It was also ridiculously expensive, costing about $6 trillion in today's value. I want to break this number down in a bit, but it's important to know that most countries had deployed all of their available manpower to the war effort, whether it was directly on the war front or in the industries supporting it. The number of people who were mobilized during this war effort was astounding. In today's video, I want to explore the finances and the money behind this war. How was this war on such a massive scale financed? So, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and let's get into it. To understand the finances behind World War I, we first need to understand what this war was all about. Many believe that it was the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Ferdinand that triggered the Great War in 1914. However, tensions between the great powers of Europe were already running high, and each of them were simply looking for an excuse to declare war on their rivals. And now, against this backdrop, great alliances were formed, secret treaties were signed, and many of these powers were just waiting for a pretext to justify a call for arms. One of the sides of this war was called the Allied Powers, and they were made up of Great Britain, Serbia, France, and Russia. Later on, Japan, Italy, and the United States would also join this side. Pitted against them were the Central Powers, composed of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. Later on, Bulgaria also joined. Around this time, many believed that the war was going to be short, but nobody expected it to go on for 4 years till 1918. Now, this assumption that the war was going to be short, this right here was where things went wrong, especially when it came to money and finances. Because so many people thought that the war was going to be short, no special preparations for a war economy were even made by any of the countries. Instead, they all tried to finance it in the usual way, by taking on massive amounts of debt. In the more advanced countries such as Britain and France, this was initially done by offering attractive yields on war bonds, twice of that of any other payable government debts. Despite this, it fell short of raising the required money to keep the war effort going. The public, or the citizens, particularly the middle class, they were not interested in this conflict, they just didn't want to participate. Ordinary citizens were pressured into buying these bonds to support the war effort, but this was a massive fail. And ironically, the people who were buying these government bonds, they were the wealthy individuals and the businesses. And these guys were already making massive profits from the war because demands for their goods and services increased. So this was the case in the Allied powers. Now contrast this with the countries in the Central Powers. They took a slightly different approach. They took loans from their central banks. In other words, they were basically printing out money. And this was a very bad idea, as you can imagine. But one of the examples that I want to talk about is the Ottoman Empire. They were a pretty big presence in the Central Powers. Now, even before the war, the Ottoman Empire was struggling to manage its finances, being heavily indebted and failing to raise enough revenue. And so it greatly reduced the salaries of all public employees and deferred payments of all debts until the war would end. Now, here's an interesting fact. Most of the Ottoman Empire's debt was owed to France and Britain. And if you remember, both France and Britain were in the Allied powers. So now it's the situation where the Ottomans were in debt to two pretty large and important countries who they were at war with. Now you might think that they were going to cancel their debt and move it over, but they didn't. Instead, get this, the government said that they would need more loans from them again after the war was over. So the Ottomans just kept the debts and the relationships in place. As you can see, the war efforts, the funding and the finances behind this war, it was pretty much all over the place. It was a pretty big mess. So we talked about some examples about how the war effort was funded, but in truth, these measures would not be enough to sustain the war even for a few months, let alone years. That's why all the countries involved turned to a new means of raising war funds. Can you guess how? More taxes. In advanced countries, this meant an expansion of the income tax bracket to cover more people, more citizens. And then other taxes, such as taxes on corporate profit, were also greatly increased. Germany, which was also an advanced economy, introduced new taxes, but it still had to rely mainly on loans to sustain its war. And this directly led to massive events of inflation. You see, Imperial Germany was highly decentralized. The central government could not tap into the wealth of its middle class the way that the other industrial countries like Britain and France or even the US could do. The same was even more true for Austria-Hungary, where the contribution made by taxes to the war effort practically remained zero. The Ottomans were in the most difficult state. It was merely surviving by getting loan after loan from already cash-strapped Central Powers. As you can see, these desperate measures were not providing enough to fund an increasingly expensive war. In the British Empire, the long-championed doctrine of the free market was just thrown overboard as the situation became increasingly desperate. For example, the British government began to directly intervene in a number of industries that were crucial in the war effort. They went so far as taking control of private finance industries, making it illegal for any private investors to buy almost any new securities. Meanwhile, on the other side, in Germany, they turned to exploitation of their conquered territories. People and resources of the occupied areas in Belgium, France, Russia, and later on Romania were forcefully integrated into the German war effort. These were truly desperate times, and on the Allied side, the countries in the Allied powers were heavily relying on Britain. And on the central side, the countries in the Central Powers, those countries were heavily relying on Germany. So there was a lot of pressure on Britain and Germany on both sides. So things were getting worse all around. However, the situation was a bit different on the other side of the world. You see, across the Atlantic, the situation could not be more different. The war in Europe had been a great boon for America. Gold was flowing into the country as the warring countries were purchasing supplies and weapons from America. I mean, that sounds familiar, right?
Stock prices of the biggest U.S. weapons manufacturers spiked, many eventually climbing to their highest point in years.
Are American manufacturers helping Russia rearm?
The United States has approved 2 defense deals with Taiwan totaling more than $440 million US.
America was raking in money at this point. As the war progressed, American banks were beginning to extend war loans to the Entente, or the Allied powers. Eventually, the US entered the war on April 6, 1917, and they had already overtaken Great Britain, which was financially struggling and battered, as the world's preeminent banker. Of course, even with a massive war chest, the US Congress would use the war as an excuse to raise taxes at home. I mean, no surprises there. World War I, or the Great War, tested the limits of what nation-states are capable of mobilizing in terms of resources and manpower. When all was said and done, the cost to the Allies was around $125 billion, and the Central Powers, $61 billion at that time. If you adjust this for inflation, this all amounts to almost $6 trillion in today's money. After the war ended, most economies were devastated. Yet, they still had a massive debt to repay. The Germans were primarily blamed for the war, and they had to pay reparations to the Allies. And the Germans were already heavily in debt, and they were not in a position to pay for these reparations. That's where the US government stepped in, and they extended loans to Germany to help to pay for these reparations. But then fast forward a few years, and the US economy starts to weaken, which, as you can imagine, massively impacted Germany's financial situation. With 2 of the world's largest powers faltering, the world slowly started to enter into the Great Depression. I made a video about the Great Depression, what caused it, and the impact it had on the world. So subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, check out the video on the Great Depression, and I'll see you again soon.